Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mailbox for the 10th of September 2012. My name is TotalBiscuit, bringing you your daily dose of community interaction, gaming discussion, and all that good stuff. You can email in mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, that's mailbox@cynicalbrit.com, with topics for future shows. The game in the background is once again Planetside of this nice big play session, currently playing with the outfit. You can probably figure out which outfit, they spam it in the chat often enough. Pretty cool guys. First email comes in here from David that says, my significant other has recently expressed worry that I may be addicted to video games. I started doing research on it and came to the conclusion I'm not addicted, but I was astonished by the lack of actual therapy for those who suffer from it. My question for you is, what is your opinion on the idea of video game addiction, and should there be more resources available to those affected by this, besides the advice that they should just stop playing video games? The problem with video game addiction is that there is really no set treatment for the condition because people don't actually know whether it is a condition. So in 2007, there was a discussion as to whether or not this should end up in the so-called DSM. That's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this pretty much catalogues every possible mental disorder that we know of, and the American Psychiatric Association concluded that they should not put it in there because there wasn't sufficient evidence that it actually existed and it was a legitimate disorder. There has been discussion that it may be quite similar to compulsive gambling. It could be an impulse control disorder. The thing about impulse control disorder specifically is that it's quite a broad categorization. It's actually classified as impulse control disorders not elsewhere classified. So that means that the disorder in question isn't specific or treatable in a very particular way in order to be classified on its own as its own disorder. Now, just because it's not in that particular manual, it doesn't mean that the thing doesn't exist. It's just we don't have enough evidence and research to indicate whether or not that is the case. For the most part, it seems to be that the conclusion is no, it's not a disorder in and of itself, but there are plenty of underlying disorders which could be classified in such a way if you were to look at excessive gaming as a symptom rather than the actual disorder itself. It's very easy to suggest that somebody with impulse control disorder could have problems controlling their impulses to play video games. It could be said that someone with an addictive personality could end up getting hooked onto video games. The problem is that you can't really classify it as video game addiction because they could have gotten addicted to another form of media, and then you can't really call it video game addiction, can you? I don't discount the idea that video game addiction could exist, potentially, but more research is required. What I don't like is how many underlying problems are simply swept under the rug of the broad stroke term of video game addiction. I don't think you really understand a person's problems if you look at him and say, oh, well, this guy is staying inside his house playing a lot of games, ergo he is addicted to video games. Rather than tackling what is causing him to stay inside the house and play video games in the first place, there could very well be an underlying social condition which is causing this. It could be something even more extreme like agoraphobia. And yet there are often suggestions that the way to fix this is play less video games, when in reality video games are being used as a way to cope, or indeed as a way to actually gain some semblance of social interaction. You never know, that potentially can lead to coming out of your shell a little bit more than otherwise would happen. That said, it could also involve going deeper into it. So how do you treat this condition? And that even assumes that it is a condition. It's difficult because we don't fully understand it. There was a nice article actually by Barnett and Colson, which was in the American Psychological Association's Journal Review of General Psychology. It stated that much of the actual debate regarding addiction could actually be a knee-jerk reaction resulting from poor understanding of gamers in general. Not just gamers, but games. We're talking about the idea that video games could potentially have some kind of built-in element that keeps people playing. There have been arguments that games are deliberately designed to be addictive to keep people playing them. The problem with that argument is that more often than not, it actually is not the case at all. Many people suggest that MMORPGs are deliberately built in such a way as to be addictive, having some kind of treadmill, and of course the idea of the carrot on the stick and these little rewards that are given to you, this little sense of satisfaction. And yet, it actually doesn't make a lot of sense for that to be the case. It's in the best interests of the MMO companies to have a bunch of casual players that pay their subscription fees and yet don't play all that much. They require less support staff. They require simply less bandwidth and server power in order to keep that many people playing. A compulsive gamer costs money. I made this same argument at the UAT many years ago when I talked about this, and things have advanced since then, and we could now talk about the idea of free-to-play games, and even then, many of the designs of free-to-play games seem to actually go against this idea that game developers are deliberately putting elements into the game that could be considered psychological hooks. More often than not, the money being made from free-to-play games is actually from more casual players that don't have the time to play a lot. You can bypass a lot of the need to pay money in free-to-play games simply by playing an awful lot, so a so-called addicted player would end up paying less, which is certainly against the very notion of making a bunch of money from that guy. But the problem is that games are consistently evolving. We now have a set of games which are essentially not games at all. Things like Farmville, Simpsons Tapped Out on iOS, or Tiny Tower. These are not games. They don't actually provide any challenge whatsoever. They're simply time sinks which require you to press buttons and occasionally stuff pops out of houses. And then can you make the idea that that is some kind of reward mechanism that keeps people playing? Or is it that people just like a very simplistic interactive experience that requires very little effort, and yet stuff happens on the screen, so they feel like they've accomplished something? We just do not know. And that's the problem. That's why there isn't more help for this, because professionals have very different ideas about how to treat it, assuming that it can be treated, assuming that it is a condition. And then, of course, you do have quite a few predatory institutions, or indeed just psychologists in general, that wish to profit from the idea that game addiction is a real problem. So, of course, you take your kid, you pay a lot of money, and you get them fixed, as it were. When in reality, it can more often than not simply be a case of that kid not wanting to do his homework because video games happen to be more fun. Here's the bottom line. This is science. We should not be knee-jerking on anything. We should not be flat out saying that it doesn't exist. We should also not be saying that it does exist without actually having the proof to justify it. We need to be very careful in its approach, and of course we need to be scientific and open-minded about the possibilities surrounding this issue. What should not be happening is for this to be used as a platform for the latest yellow journalism, which is sadly happening frequently and needs to stop. This one comes in from Robert that says, when Sleeping Dogs was released, I bought a Steam key on a popular key-selling website. The main reason was at first that I live in Germany, and our version of Sleeping Dogs was censored and delayed for weeks because of censorship that had to be applied. But what really surprised me was the price. I got a working EU uncensored key for under €30, while Steam wants 50. My question is, how can these sites sell these keys so cheaply? And furthermore, who gets the short end of the stick? Do I just hurt Steam or the dev? I really enjoyed the game and don't want to hurt the developer by buying from those sites. And last but not least, why does Steam allow those sales? They don't get €1, but I use their download service. Well, for one thing, that's not true. They do get money. The Steam key can only be generated if it's already been paid for. There's a number of places that these keys can come from. More often than not, they come from boxed copies that are sold in areas where games are cheaper. There's a reason why there are 2 tiers of EU pricing. This might seem unfair, but it's designed to ensure that piracy is lower than it otherwise would be in lower income areas of the world. If you try and sell a game for $60 in a country where $60 is a lot of money, then you will fail to do so. Piracy is rife in low-income areas because it just makes more sense. If you are worried about not being able to eat, then the last thing you want to be doing is spending a bunch of money on a video game. So the way that companies have counteracted this is to have regional restrictions as well as regional sales for certain products. So more often than not, I would imagine these keys end up coming from those areas. Now, this is not always the case. There have been some rather dodgy stories about keys turning up which are actually stolen. It's impossible to really know whether or not that's the case when it comes to these sites. I would imagine that most of their inventory is actually legitimate, but who's to say whether or not some of those keys didn't come off the back of a lorry somewhere? Now, this is something that Valve could probably deal with if they wanted to, and I'm kind of surprised that they haven't already. If these keys exist in lower income areas of the world and yet work when you register them in EU Tier 1 or in the US, for instance, then that indicates a problem with the system itself, and it's probably something that they could clamp down on. They already have regional restrictions and regional settings. There are even now parts of the terms of service which will potentially ban you if you happen to use something like a VPN to bypass the regional restrictions, so it's a little bit risky. It's difficult to nail down exactly why the prices are cheaper on some of these sites, but I have noticed that lately they haven't been quite so much. When G2 Play first started, for instance, you were getting ridiculous prices on a lot of things. There were accusations back in 2009 that there were stolen keys. In fact, I heard from a great many people, and there's evidence all over the internet, that says some people got their keys blacklisted. Apparently with Blood Bowl, when that came out, G2Play bought a bunch of keys from Asian countries where the keys were cheaper and then sold them to UK and US customers for a profit. Now, as far as I'm aware, that isn't actually illegal. Not to the best of my knowledge at any rate. However, that's going to end up becoming a problem at some point. This isn't like importing from a different country. It's not like, say, buying a PSP and then shipping it to the UK from Japan. We remember the issues with Lixang and all sorts of other things. Sony were not happy about that. These are keys. They can be emailed, and supposedly they work all over the world. And yet there isn't a huge amount stopping companies like this from buying from those markets and then selling on for a profit. The problem is, if this becomes commonplace, then there will be restrictions put in place. These games are cheaper in that region because the market cannot bear a higher price, and any attempt to increase the price will result in ridiculous piracy rates. I mean, those countries already have ridiculous piracy rates. In comparison to the UK, the US, and Europe, you've got Asian countries and, of course, Eastern Bloc, where piracy is just out of control. So, in order to combat that, you try and sell games cheaper. If that is exploited on a wide scale in order to provide cheaper games for US, UK, and Europe, then you're going to run into some fairly serious problems. That said, on your own, I don't really see a problem with buying it. I mean, what's really annoying about the German version, as you said, is that it is censored, which is a complete damn nightmare for the Germans. So trying to bypass that by purchasing a key, I wouldn't be too worried about it. Money has still gone to the devs, money has still gone to Steam. That key could not have been generated otherwise. Just bear in mind that you are taking a risk. I believe that doing so is most likely against the Steam terms of service because it is essentially bypassing regional restrictions, which Valve definitely does not like. They have started cracking down on mass gifting, for instance, from different countries. This was a practice that many people took part in and continue to take part in, and yet Valve is starting to realize, oi, if you're gifting hundreds upon hundreds of games from a cheaper region or to people that can't otherwise buy them because of a regional restriction, then there's a problem there, and we're not going to allow that to happen anymore. People's accounts are actually getting warned, suspended, or closed for that kind of behavior. So honestly, I think it's only a matter of time, and when you start using these keys, you are taking a risk. I don't think it's necessarily the consumer's responsibility to not look for the best deal. In fact, I would say quite the opposite. It is the consumer's responsibility to be responsible with their money. However, I don't see this kind of thing lasting all that much longer, and I think that major providers are going to start cracking down on it pretty shortly if they haven't already. Bear in mind when using those sites, let the buyer beware. It could be a stolen code. It is most likely taken from a different price bracket region, and that key could end up getting blacklisted, and it has happened in the past, so caveat emptor. This one comes in from Robert that says, often when I browse game forums, I see people rant about console ports because the games somewhat favor the use of a controller. Quotes like, oh, I'm playing on a PC and the controls with mouse and keyboard should be perfect are not rare. I can understand that people don't want bad controls when they don't have a controller, but sometimes people seem to ask for superior keyboard and mouse control even when the game was created with a controller in mind. I for myself enjoy playing with a controller on my PC because I don't have to sit tight and I can relax in my chair. Could it be that some folks identify the PC and the console over the input device and just feed their personal fanboyism? Well, yes. Okay, so the standard that I think should be adhered when it comes to PC ports is the controls should be functional and you should not be at a major disadvantage for using them if you happen to have picked a mouse and keyboard, because that is the native way of playing on a PC. It's the same as suggesting that if you were to play a game on a console, you require a keyboard and mouse in order to play it to a reasonable degree. Now, that is not to say that the keyboard and mouse should always be the superior option. It is good for some games. It is very, very good for third-person and first-person shooters. It provides superior accuracy to a controller. There's really no question about that. It is good for real-time strategies, and it's more often than not good for management games and sims. Also, for obvious reasons, because more often than not, the menus are designed in that way, and you can get far greater accuracy and speed on a keyboard and mouse than you ever could on a controller. After that, things start to get a little bit fuzzy. A genre which is very much at home on PC and yet doesn't necessarily work all that well with keyboard and mouse is actually the sim genre. And I'm talking about things like flight simulators, train simulators, ship simulators. These kind of games more often than not actually work better with a joystick. So, for instance, I just picked up an X52 because I wanted to get back into some of the flight sim games. I wanted to get back into Terran Conflict, and I thought, hey, an X52 system would be good, and that's got an external throttle on the left hand and a joystick with infinite number of buttons on the right hand. And if I use this, then I'm going to have a better time in flight sim games, I'm going to have a better time in space combat games, and of course, modern jet fighter or World War II combat flight sims. Are those games badly designed because they perform better on a joystick than they do on a keyboard and mouse? The answer is no. I'd like to talk about racing games as well. So you can play racing games with a wheel, you can play racing games with a pad or with a keyboard. Keyboard is more often than not suboptimal because a keyboard is a digital input. What does that mean? It means it's off or on, there is no analog element to it. That means trying to do very accurate turns at a very specific angle or speed is difficult. It's the same with the idea of acceleration and braking. If I use analog triggers, I can hold down the button harder and it will potentially accelerate quicker depending on the game. If I'm trying to accelerate in a video game using keyboard and mouse, that is not going to happen. Either I'm going to be flooring it or it's going to be off. That is the only possible option. So what I would say is, as a PC gamer, you happen to be in the very lucky position of being able to plug in pretty much anything. You can use a Wiimote if you like. You can use a Kinect if you like. Hacks exist to allow that to happen. Indeed, you don't even need a hack to use a Wiimote. It's very, very easy indeed. The thing about a PC is that it's an open platform in a way that consoles are not. We can use all manner of different peripherals, which means that, as far as I'm concerned, we should be embracing that idea where it's appropriate. When you can come down and say this is bad, and this is a bad port, is when a game should perform just fine with keyboard and mouse and yet doesn't due to laziness or developer incompetence. Things like mouse acceleration. The problems that Prototype 2 had, for instance, where the mouse acceleration was actually tied to the frame rate, which is an astonishingly stupid thing to do. Forced auto-aim. All manner of different configuration problems. The inability to invert. Unrebindable keys, which can cause all manner of problems for left-handed gamers, for instance. This is when developers are lazy, and this is when you can say, this is a bad PC port. What you can't do is turn around and say, this is a bad PC port because this racing game doesn't perform quite as well with a keyboard as it does with a racing wheel or with a controller. It's funny that people never really seem to mention joysticks or racing wheels. Back in the day, a joystick was essentially required for many games. If you didn't play Free Space with a joystick, if you didn't play X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, a game which refused to install without a joystick, then you were going to have a lesser experience than someone that owned a joystick. We never mentioned that, and yet we get very upset about the idea of a controller, and I think it really does, to some degree, come down to bitterness as well as personal fanboyism. Some people just despise the very idea of controllers. The whole PC gaming master race thing was supposed to be a joke, and yet some people actually take it seriously. And while I do believe the PC is the best gaming format, it is technically superior to every console on the market. It is the most open. It has the biggest variety of games. I do not believe that every game should control perfectly with a keyboard and mouse because it is an absolutely ridiculous idea. If it is a genre that otherwise works fine, and there are plenty of examples of that particular genre being played with a keyboard and mouse without a problem though, and this particular game does not work that way, that is the time when you can come down hard and say this is a bad port. Okay folks, that is me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. I'll see you next time.